It was Alexander Hamilton who said, "I'm not throwing away my shot." I might have watched and listened to the Hamilton soundtrack more times than Mazepin spins during a Grand Prix weekend, but I seem to remember there's a lot of conjecture as to what he means by that. Some might even argue that there's a missing verse to that song, namely, "I'm not throwing away my shot, comma, just like BMW did when they blew their shot at being F1 world champions in the late 2000s. Again, I'm neither a historian or musicals expert, so that's going off my hazy memory. It could easily be forgotten or overlooked by those starting to watch F1 now, but for those of us who have watched F1 since the early 2000s, there's a tinge of sadness every time we see Robert Kubica depart the pits on a Friday morning in his Alfa Romeo, ni Sauber, ni BMW Sauber, and we remember that duo's exploits over a decade ago now, and ponder just how BMW, one of the most successful F1 engine providers of all time, could get it oh so wrong. BMW were involved with F1 since the very early days of the championship. As early as 1952, drivers and engineers were grabbing hold of BMW 328 racing cars and adapting them in order to go racing. At the 1952 German Grand Prix, 9 of the 34 cars entered were modified 328s. But that would be it as far as BMW F1 involvement went for the next 30 years, bar some more 328 entries in 53 and 54, whilst a couple of BMW-powered Formula 2 cars entered the German Grand Prix in 67 and 68, as both the F1 and F2 races were run concurrently at the circuit. During that interlude, BMW tasted plenty of success elsewhere, with the likes of touring cars, Formula 2, and at Le Mans. By 1982, BMW were back in action in the big leagues, now powering the reigning world champions of Nelson Piquet and Brabham. That year was a development year for the partnership, with Piquet and teammate Riccardo Patrese alternating between the new BMW engine and the older Ford Cosworth engine, even running different engines in different cars at the same race weekend. The engine was unreliable, but held together at the Canadian Grand Prix for Piquet to secure BMW's first F1 win, followed by Patrese in the Cosworth-powered sister car. That success was followed up by championship success in 1983, as Piquet won 3 races en route to vanquishing Alain Prost and Renault. From there, though, the BMW Brabham Dream Team would slip into a nightmare. Across the next 2 seasons, the BMW engine was, without a doubt, the most powerful on the F1 grid. The qualifying performance of the BMW engine would take Piquet to 9 pole positions from 16 rounds in 1984 alone, and was producing over 1,000 horsepower in qualifying mode by 1985. It was also sadly not particularly durable and as reliable as my upload schedule, which, when added to repeated issues with high fuel consumption, meant that the sight of a Brabham pulling over to the side of the road during a Grand Prix was a common occurrence. No further championships came in this time, with just 3 wins from Piquet across 84 and 85. By 1986, the engine was growing only more powerful, with BMW now claiming a maximum output of 1,400 horsepower, which, if true and barring the introduction of infinity stones into future engines, would make it the most powerful Formula 1 engine ever. Brabham, though, would only score 2 points all season with their BT55 car and plummeted to 9th in the Constructors' Championship. Whilst Gerhard Berger and his Benetton BMW romped to success at the Mexican Grand Prix, and the other Benetton of Teo Fabi took 2 pole positions, it wasn't enough to convince BMW, and they announced their withdrawal at the end of 1986, though continued to supply Brabham for 1 more year, and Arrows for another 2 with rebadged Megatron engines. 10 years later, BMW were evaluating a return into Formula 1, and found a partner in the form of Williams. Williams and former engine partner Renault had been together since 1989, winning 63 Grand Prix in that time, and winning titles in 92, 93, 96 and 97. But despite that success, Renault bid Williams and F1 adieu at the end of 1997, leaving the world champions in need of a new engine supplier. BMW promptly slipped into whatever was the equivalent of DMs in the 1990s, and in 1998, Williams signed a 6-year deal with BMW, starting from 2000 onwards. Over the next 2 years, Williams ran rebadged Renault engines, whilst BMW rigorously tested the new engine, having Williams test driver Jörg Müller put the engine through its paces in the back of an older Williams model. 2000 saw Ralf Schumacher take a debut podium for the new partnership, en route to 3rd in the Constructors' Championship, before he and new teammate Juan Pablo Montoya reintroduced Williams and BMW to the winner's circle in 2001, winning 4 races between the two of them, and were unlucky not to win more owing to reliability issues. 2002 was dominated by Ferrari and Michael Schumacher, but the other Schumacher still managed to win in Malaysia, whilst Montoya showed off the pace of the car on Saturdays, taking 7 pole positions as the team climbed to second in the Constructors. 2003 was even stronger, as Williams were in championship contention throughout the year, with Montoya and Schumacher winning 2 races apiece. Heading into the penultimate race of the season, Williams were top of the Constructors' Championship, whilst Montoya was only 3 points behind drivers' leader Michael Schumacher. An accident with Ferrari's Rubens Barrichello on lap 3 earned Montoya a drive-through penalty, and though he recovered to 6th, championship rivals Schumacher and Kimi Raikkonen were 1st and 2nd, and Montoya was out of championship contention, whilst Williams dropped to 2nd. It had been their most successful season together yet, but it was still well short of what both parties were expecting, and the cracks were beginning to show. To say Williams and BMW didn't really get along would be like saying that having McDonald's is a marginally less healthy option than having a salad. By 2003, 2 facts were widely accepted up and down the paddock. First, that BMW comfortably had the most powerful engine on the grid, and that secondly, it was unable to show its full potential since Williams were incapable of producing a competitive car. BMW Motorsport director Mario Tyson was not shy about letting the media know this on a regular basis, whilst it was reported by the Daily Mirror that on one occasion BMW engineers had been found pinning up a picture of a tortoise to the wall in their F1 truck with the caption, "Caught at a secret test, the new BMW Williams." Unsurprisingly, Williams didn't take this public sniping well, with team owner Frank Williams openly accusing BMW of poisoning their relationship, declaring previous partnerships with Renault and Honda as much more successful and cooperative, and then finishing off by slamming down the receipt of, "You don't hear us constantly asking about the 150 engine failures BMW had in 2000 alone." Tensions continued to mount. Williams suffered an uncompetitive year in 2004 with their distinctive Walrus car, winning just once and falling out of the top 3 in the Constructors' Championship for the first time in their BMW partnership. With both drivers Montoya and Ralf Schumacher leaving Williams at the year's end, there were attempts to price Jenson Button, who'd finished 3rd in the World Championship that year, out of his BAR contract, attempts that proved unsuccessful. With Tyson and BMW continuing to rant and rave about Williams' inability to put together a championship-winning car, not helped by the failure to sign a big name like Button, 2005 was signing up to be a make-or-break year for the partnership. Williams instead signed Mark Webber to lead the charge, and then, in an attempt to smooth over the cracks with BMW, chose BMW's preferred choice for the second driver, German Nick Heidfeld, over Frank Williams' personal preference, Antonio Pizzonia. For Frank Williams to bow to such pressures showed the desperation on Williams' part to make this work. It did not work. 2005 ended up being Williams' and BMW's first winless campaign since 2000, with one of few highlights being a double podium finish for Heidfeld and Webber at the Monaco Grand Prix. The continued downturn was enough for BMW to crunch the numbers and realise that enough was equal to, or greater than, enough. They decided it was time to take matters into their own hands and offered to buy Williams outright. Williams refused, and so BMW turned their attentions elsewhere. They had been discussing a potential engine supply deal with the Sauber team for 2006 onwards, and as the ball of team ownership got rolling, so the future for BMW and F1 looked set. On the 22nd of June 2005, BMW announced they had officially bought Sauber and would be running a full works operation in F1 from 2006 onwards. It was more or less the perfect starting place for BMW. Sauber had been in F1 since 1993, and whilst they hadn't tasted much in the way of success in that time, they were a team steeped in history and experience, hungry for success, which, combined with the vast resources of BMW, seemed a real dream team for the future. BMW respected that history, hence their branding of the team not as BMW F1, but as BMW Sauber. But critics were cautious on the potential success of the new team. It was all well and good to be sat on the sidelines bemoaning Williams for their failure to reach championship glory. Now they had to be the ones to maximise the potential of the still highly regarded BMW engine. Realistically though, 2006 would be a consolidation year, one in which to develop the next year's car, drive recruitment into the team, and mould the Sauber team into their own. Leading the charge was the man they'd campaigned a seat for last season, Quick Nick Heidfeld. So impressed were BMW with Heidfeld's progress in 2005, in which he'd taken his maiden pole position and 3 further podiums, including back-to-back second places at Monaco and Europe, that they paid for Williams to release him, and they signed him on a 3-year contract. Webber, IndyCar champion Dan Wheldon, and GP2 runner-up Heikki Kovalainen were all linked with the second seat, but the team eventually settled on honouring the contract of 2005 Sauber driver and 1997 world champion Jacques Villeneuve. If the long time it took to confirm Villeneuve didn't already put him under pressure, then the arrival of their new highly rated test driver, Renault World Series champion Robert Kubica, who'd take part in Friday practice throughout the season, certainly would. After a quiet opening round in Bahrain, they scored their first points as a works team when Villeneuve finished 7th at the second round in Malaysia. It could have been even better, as Heidfeld had driven a great race to climb to 5th, ahead of both Ferraris, before his engine failed with 7 laps to go. Even better, the two both finished in the top 6 at the next race, Australia. Heidfeld was a solid 4th, even running as high as 2nd at one point after Michael Schumacher had crashed out on lap 32. Unluckily for Nick, the car struggled more than their rivals with keeping tyre temperatures whilst behind the safety car, and once the race restarted, he found himself swallowed by the chasing pack. Without that issue, Heidfeld and BMW could have been on the podium in just their 3rd outing. Villeneuve, meanwhile, had started from the back after a grid penalty, but had climbed to 7th just before Schumacher's accident. Unfortunately for him, he pitted just as the safety car was deployed, losing a chunk of time and eventually finishing 6th. The next 8 races saw a brace of point-scoring finishes, though never higher than 7th. Heading to Germany round 12, the team were a respectable 6th in the Constructors' Championship, whilst Heidfeld was rounding out the top 10 in the Drivers' Championship. Villeneuve, meanwhile, was a lowly 15th, with half the points tally of Heidfeld. With Tyson openly unhappy with the Canadians' results, and tester Robert Kubica regularly topping the timesheets in Friday practice, it was becoming a question of when, not if, Villeneuve would get the chop. The when turned out to be very soon indeed. On lap 30 of the German Grand Prix, Villeneuve crashed heavily, and with the Hungarian Grand Prix the next weekend, was reportedly complaining of headaches and muscle pains. BMW wasted no time in announcing Kubica would stand in for Villeneuve for the next race, in the quickest usage of the term medical reasons since a man last phoned in sick with man flu. Not wanting to be part of a shootout with BMW's clearly favoured son, Villeneuve said "F this S, I'm out," and promptly left the sport. Hungary was a chaotic, wet-dry race, with a lot of the usual race-winning suspects out or off the pace. Kimi Räikkönen had led from pole, but misjudged his approach when lapping Tonio Liuzzi at the final corner, and crashed. Alonso took over at the front, but after pitting for dry tyres on lap 51, a wheel nut failed, and Alonso was into the wall. Alonso's main title rival Michael Schumacher, meanwhile, was suffering a nightmare race. Despite climbing to 2nd after Alonso's retirement, his pace began to drop as the track dried, his tyres faded, and rivals switched to dry tyres. Ferrari technical director Ross Brawn, concerned about the form of the dry tyres he'd seen on Friday, refused to bring him in to change over. The result was a slow and steady march back through the order to an eventual 8th place finish. Through it all came Jenson Button to score his first win from 14th on the grid. Behind him was McLaren's Pedro de la Rosa for what would be the Spaniard's first ever podium, pursued by Nick Heidfeld, who took BMW Sauber's first podium. Behind him, Kubica had a mixed bag of a debut. He beat Heidfeld into Q3 by 0.4 seconds and started 9th. Come race day, he struggled in the early wet conditions, hitting the tyre wall early on and dropping down the order as he came in for a new nose. Despite that, he carved through the field to finish 7th for 2 points on his debut, only to be cruelly disqualified for having an underweight car owing to the severe degradation of his tyres. Despite Heidfeld being on the podium, it was Kubica who was catching people's eyes, not Heidfeld, and that would be a story for their years to come. #foreshadowing. There were no points in Turkey, but history was made when BMW's new test driver became the then youngest participant in a Grand Prix weekend, at just 19 years and 53 days old, Sebastian Vettel. The team's good form picked up again in Italy with the high-speed nature of the Monza circuit suiting the BMW Sauber's impressive straight-line speed. Heidfeld qualified 3rd, with Kubica not far behind in 6th. At a time when refuelling was still part of the tactical side of the sport, teams would set their times in Q3 with their race fuel on board. Technical director Willy Rampf claimed that, on fuel-adjusted figures, Heidfeld would have been on pole. It was Kubica who shone at the start though, charging up into 3rd, whilst Heidfeld fell to 7th. He ran 3rd through the first stint, and promptly took the lead when Räikkönen and Michael Schumacher pitted, marking the first time he, BMW Sauber and a Polish driver had ever led a Grand Prix. He dropped to 4th after the final round of pit stops after being passed by Fernando Alonso, but recovered his 3rd place when Alonso's engine went nah just 2 laps later. 3rd place in just his 3rd race had a lot of people excited, and any doubt over his long-term prospects with the team had been abandoned. Meanwhile, Heidfeld dropped back after receiving a drive-through penalty for speeding in the pit lane and could only manage 8th. For the second time in 3 races, it was Kubica catching everyone's attention and Heidfeld being left so far in the shade that he didn't need to apply factor anything for his skin. Another big result should have followed in China, but Kubica, having climbed from 17th to 5th, changed to dry tyres too soon and very quickly dropped down the order. Heidfeld, meanwhile, was running 4th with just 2 laps to go when he was wrong-footed by backmarkers Albers and Sato, and then hit under braking by Rubens Barrichello with just 2 corners to go. Button, Della Rosa and a wingless Barrichello all took advantage, whilst a furious Heidfeld somehow came across the finish line with a very unhealthy right rear. With another point scored in Japan, BMW Sauber scored 36 points and finished 5th in the Constructors, just ahead of Toyota. It was as good as the team could have hoped for in their transition year. The tally of 36 points marked their best season since 2002, points adjusted, whilst 15 point scoring finishes and 2 podiums were the most Sauber had ever achieved in what was their 14th year of F1 competition. Not only had BMW been solid, but they were frequently pushing the envelope. Whilst their low downforce rear wing or their twin pillar nose was swiftly banned, it showed the team were ready to make the push to find those extra tenths, no matter where. Looking ahead to 2007, BMW were confident on taking another step and were aiming for 4th place, with McLaren and Ferrari hotly tipped to be battling out for the World Championship, whilst reigning champions Renault, despite losing 2-time reigning champion Fernando Alonso to rivals McLaren, were expecting to still be in the mix. BMW had set out their objective to be best of the rest, and that's exactly what they did, only even better than they might have envisioned. At the season opener in Australia, Heidfeld qualified 3rd, splitting the 2 McLarens, and a great start vaulted him to 2nd by the first corner. BMW had clearly improved from the last year, but Heidfeld's lofty position was partly attained by running lighter on fuel than those around him, and even with that factor in place, he still found race leader Raikkonen soaring away into the distance, whilst Alonso and Hamilton swarmed over the back of him, with the 2 eventually jumping the German in the pits. Heidfeld finished 4th, 20 seconds behind Hamilton, but 30 seconds ahead of Giancarlo Fisichella and Renault. Kubica, meanwhile, had started 5th and ran 4th, before retiring with gearbox problems. In this race alone, we saw an accurate summary of what BMW Sauber's 2007 season would look like. On one hand, that the team had vaulted Renault as best of the rest. On outright pace, the team couldn't hope to challenge the McLarens or the Ferraris, but were comfortably clear of the chasing pack, meaning that both Heidfeld and Kubica could realistically go to each race expecting a minimum of 5th and 6th, and be there to take advantage of any slip-ups from those in front. In this instance, an accident from Felipe Massa in qualifying dropping him to the back of the grid. On the other hand, though, was the poor reliability of the car, particularly in the opening part of the season. Across the next 3 races, Malaysia, Bahrain and Spain, BMW picked up a trio of 4th places, the highlight being an audacious move from Heidfeld passing Alonso around the outside of turn 5 in Bahrain, but also suffered more gearbox problems, an errant wheel nut and an open fuel filler flap, limiting the point scoring capabilities of the other car. After Monaco, one of very few races in 2007 when BMW failed to emerge as best of the rest, being beaten to 4th by Fisichella after a tactical choice to run heavier on fuel early on failed to come off, the F1 circus made its way to Montreal for the Canadian Grand Prix. We can't talk in depth about BMW's time as a works entry without touching on the events of Canada 2007. On lap 27, Robert Kubica, pushing hard to make up lost time after a scrambled pit stop during a safety car period, was closing in on Jarno Trulli's Toyota. Arriving at the left kink before the hairpin at just shy of 170 miles an hour, Kubica ran into the back of the Toyota, clipping the left rear wheel, and with his car's nose now jammed under the rear of the Toyota, flipped up and over the grass verge into one of the surrounding concrete walls, making impact at 145 miles an hour. The next impact ripped off 3 wheels, whereupon he bounced back towards the track. The car dug into the grass and flipped again as it went across the track, doing a half roll before it hit the crash barrier on the other side of the circuit. Miraculously, in testament to the quality of safety in motorsport, even in 2007, Kubica escaped with only a sprained ankle and concussion. There would be better days for Kubica on the Montreal circuit in the future. It sadly took the shine off what had been an excellent weekend for Heidfeld, who had started 3rd and then jumped Alonso at the start when the Spaniard was pushing too hard to pass Hamilton and ran wide onto the grass. From there, Heidfeld ran 2nd for the majority of the remainder of the race, but despite the safety car from Kubica's accident allowing him to close up to the back of race leader Hamilton, he never had the pace to push for the lead and took 2nd, another best result for the team from the German. More history was made at the next race when, with Kubica unsurprisingly ruled out of the race on medical grounds, replacement Sebastian Vettel would make history coming home in 8th as the then youngest point scorer in F1. Amazingly, Kubica was back in the car for the next race, the French Grand Prix, and more amazingly still, he led home Heidfeld in 4th and 5th as BMW resumed their best of the rest position, with another 4th and 6th coming at the British Grand Prix. They should have done even better at the European Grand Prix, but disaster struck on lap 1 when, with rain beginning to fall, Heidfeld ran into Kubica into the second corner, pitching both cars into a spin. In a race of high attrition and incidents aplenty, the two were able to scrape back into 6th and 7th, but it was a golden opportunity for a big result gone begging. At Hungary, with the McLarens having a, to put it lightly, minor squabble in qualifying, Heidfeld was promoted to second on the grid, BMW Sauber's best qualifying yet. Despite being jumped by Raikkonen at the start, he had a good run to 3rd place, even holding off Alonso late on, with Kubica not far behind in 5th. After a 4th and 8th in Turkey, the consistency of the team was fully highlighted in the drivers' table. After round 12, the battle for the title was very much between McLaren and Ferrari, but Heidfeld was mathematically still in contention. No one had very much hope or expectations that McLaren and Ferrari would proceed to retire from every remaining race, or that Heidfeld would win 5 in a row, but for the team to be within such touching distance of the title showed off the team's relentless consistency. Best of the rest performances continued to flow through to the end of the year, with a 4th, 3 5ths, a 6th and 2 7ths. More memorable highlights came through an epic on-track battle between Kubica and Massa over 6th place in Japan, as well as Kubica leading in China before a hydraulic failure put paid to any hopes of a maiden win. After McLaren's disqualification from the Constructors' Championship, the team was second overall, a long way off champions Ferrari, but with double the points tally of 3rd place Renault, whilst Heidfeld and Kubica were, suitably, 5th and 6th in the Drivers' Championship. After a solid opening campaign, the team had taken another step up in 2007, but already there was chat amongst the team of continuing this trend. Both Heidfeld and Rampf were realistic in their appraisals for the future. McLaren and Ferrari would be hard to catch up to. Finding the 2 tenths needed to rise to the top of the midfield is relatively easy. Finding the rest of those tenths to make that final step a lot harder. Not that BMW weren't going to try, and if they kept improving at this rate, who was going to stop them? Pre-season winter testing had been disappointing, but by the time that 2008 season started in Australia, BMW Sauber had either just played a superb bluff or immediately rectified those issues, for they were back on the pace. Kubica qualified second, and bar a mistake on one of his laps, would almost certainly have taken pole. In a chaotic season opener, he ran second early on, dropped to 4th after the first round of pit stops, and then lost further ground when he was forced to stop earlier than planned for his second stop. Stuck behind Sebastian Bourdais, he was hit from behind by Kazuki Nakajima later on whilst in 6th, and forced out. Thankfully, Heidfeld was there to pick up the pieces, and he benefited from the misfortune of those around him to take 2nd place. Kubica's misfortune was rectified in Malaysia when, starting 4th, he beat Jarno Trulli off the line, and then claimed another position when Massa spun off in front. His 2nd place was the best result of his career so far, whilst Heidfeld, after clashing with Trulli at the start, recovered to 6th, with BMW Sauber's first fastest lap. In Bahrain, a storming lap from Kubica saw him come out on top in qualifying, and headline writers everywhere rejoiced as they finally got to use their "a pole on pole" line they'd workshopped for several weeks previously. But a bad start saw him drop behind Massa before Raikkonen sailed past a couple of laps later. And that's the way they ran to the flag, that the Ferrari struggled to drop Kubica, and he was only 5 seconds behind Massa at the race end. With Heidfeld close behind in 4th, BMW were truly in the fight, highlighted by the fact that, after 3 races, the top of the constructors' table read McLaren on 28 points, Ferrari on 29, and BMW Sauber on 30 points, whilst Heidfeld and Kubica were 2nd and 3rd in the drivers' table. The run of podiums ended in Spain, but BMW and Kubica were clearly still on the pace as they finished 4th. To show how far they had progressed in 1 year, when Kubica had finished 4th at the same race last year, he was 14 seconds from Alonso in front, and 31 seconds behind race winner Massa. In 2008, Kubica hounded Hamilton home to finish just a second behind the 3rd placed man, and was only 5 seconds behind race winner Raikkonen. A less than perfect weekend in Turkey still saw the team claim 4th and 5th, before a return to the podium for Kubica with another 2nd place, this time in the wet at Monaco. It was a consistent drive, matched with good strategy, meaning that, when stuck behind Massa after his first stop, the team could make the call to switch to dry tyres to allow Kubica to up the pace and vault the Brazilian in the pits. Bad luck for Heidfeld saw Alonso clatter into the side of him whilst running 5th, and then a puncture dropped him to last. For round 7, F1 returned to Canada, where just 12 months previously Kubica had suffered his horrifying accident. The tone between the two races could not have been more night and day, and not even an Oscar-winning writer could have pictured the scenes that would unfold at the 2008 race. Hamilton and Kubica duked it out for pole, and both were on top of the timesheets at one point. In the end, it was the McLaren man who stole pole in the final seconds of the session, Kubica settling for second. Unlike the chaos at the start of the previous year, it was a clean first lap. Hamilton charged away from pole, keeping a steady gap of 7 seconds from Kubica by lap 17, who was followed by Raikkonen and the Williams of Nico Rosberg. The gap vanished when the safety car was called out, as the Force India of Adrian Sutil, out with a gearbox problem, was retrieved from the track. It was perfect timing for those who had qualified with a light fuel load to make their first stop, and 2 laps later, that's exactly what the front 4 did. Hamilton was fueled for longer, allowing Kubica and Raikkonen to jump ahead, and both were stopped at the end of the pit lane, waiting to be released back onto the circuit. Hamilton, maybe distracted by the fact he'd lost 2 places, maybe oblivious to the big red light at the end of the pit lane, or maybe just feeling like playing real-life Burnout, charged down the pit lane and failed to stop in time. He narrowly avoided Kubica, but ran hard into the back of Raikkonen, taking off the Ferrari's rear wing, breaking his front suspension, and taking both out of the race. Rosberg, even 6 years before the two clashed on track at Mercedes, was determined to one-up Hamilton and made the same manoeuvre, slamming into the back of Hamilton, but escaping with just a broken nose. Elsewhere, Massa found his own unique way of ruining his race, suffering a major leak with his fuel rig and being forced to pit twice within 2 laps in order to refuel correctly. The 3 race winners of the year so far were now out of contention, and because of pit stop strategies, the front of the field was now entirely jumbled up. Those who had stayed out planned to run longer and stop once, and leading the pack was Heidfeld, followed by the ragtag bunch of Rubens Barrichello, Nakajima, Mark Webber, David Coulthard, Timo Glock, and Trulli. Best place of those who had just stopped was Kubica, who was now in 10th, and closely pursued by the ever-wily Fernando Alonso. Heidfeld pitted for his one stop and emerged in front of Kubica, though with a heavier fuel load made very little effort to keep Kubica behind. BMW Sauber were now in prime position to win their first race, with both drivers leading the pack on different strategies. Gradually, all the one-stoppers dived into the pits and there was a wild succession of unexpected leaders. Veterans Barrichello, Coulthard and then Trulli, followed by Glock in just his 11th F1 start. When Glock pitted from the lead, it was Kubica who was now in front, and the question was only how much of a gap he could open over Heidfeld to ensure he'd re-emerge into the lead. On lap 49, he pitted, and came out just in front of Heidfeld. From there, it was a comfortable run to the line as BMW Sauber took a 1-2 for their first win. The errors for McLaren and Ferrari had catapulted Kubica not just to his maiden win, but the lead of the driver's title. After the race, analysts couldn't help but notice it was Kubica who had been given the preferable strategy, and Heidfeld had been somewhat sacrificed in order to hold up Alonso and increase Kubica's gap at the front. That said, if it was the case, it wasn't a bad call, for as loyal a servant as Heidfeld had been to BMW, it was Kubica who was in front of the championship, compared to rivals Ferrari, who had Raikkonen and Massa very evenly matched and consistently taking points off each other, and McLaren, who were insistent on not favouring one driver over the other until later in the season. Optimising the strategy around Kubica to maximise his point scoring might just be the best way to keep him in the unexpected title fight. And yet, you could perhaps tell it was highly unexpected, because from this highest of highs, it was from here that everything began to fall apart. BMW had a very rigid plan when it came to achieving championship success, far better than Toyota's Step 1, spend loads of money, Step 2, Step 3, success. The plan was for 2006 to be a consolidation year with regular point scoring. Check. Then for 2007 to step up a notch, be best of the rest and score podiums. Check. 2008, more podiums and a race win. Check once more. And then 2009, world champions. No sooner, no deviation from the grand plan. It meant that, once BMW Sauber had ticked off the box next to win race, all development work on the 2008 car effectively ground to a halt. It was an attitude that frustrated Kubica to no end. As he correctly pointed out, if you have a car that's good enough to win races, that's good enough to lead both championships at one point during the season, you don't need to wait a year to try for the championship. Not only that, but Formula 1 is a fickle beast at the best of times. Just ask the likes of Jenson Button or Esteban Ocon. As Eminem so wisely wrote, if you had one shot or one opportunity to seize everything you ever wanted in one moment, would you capture it or just let it slip? For Kubica, the time was now to take this chance. For BMW, it was a time to stick their fingers in their ears, sing la 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 extremely loudly, and gesticulate at their grand plan. It meant that, for Kubica, set in his mindset of this being his one and only opportunity to gun for the World Championship, he was now doing so with the ever-increasing disadvantage of a car falling behind in development compared to rivals McLaren and Ferrari. But that's not to say he didn't have a damn good go at it. As if to really hammer home the point that they weren't concentrating on 2008 as hard anymore, the next 4 races proved it barren for Kubica, with just 7 points picked up in that time. 4 of them came in the next round, France, where Ferrari romped to a 1-2, with race winner Massa now taking over at the top of the table, leading Kubica, now second, by just 2 points. Kubica ran around 4th and 5th most of the race, but was beaten to the flag by Jarno Trulli's Toyota and Kovalainen. At least he scored points though. Heidfeld, determined to show everyone how little attention BMW were now paying to their car, trundled home in an undistinguished 13th place. BMW were back on the podium at the British Grand Prix, only it was unfortunately the wrong driver stood up there. In torrential conditions, Heidfeld stayed out of trouble to finish second to an inspired Hamilton, who was more than a minute up the road. Kubica probably would have joined them up there, but aquaplaned off the track on lap 39. It was Kubica's only real mistake of the year, and arguably was one that he couldn't really be blamed for. Germany brought another great result for Heidfeld after a great strategic call not to pit under a safety car triggered by a heavy crash from Timo Glock elevated him up to second, eventually coming home 4th following his pit stop. Kubica meanwhile struggled greatly with his tyres on his last stint, and could only take 7th. Hungary looked like things might pick up again, with Kubica starting 4th, and then come race day, Hamilton suffered a puncture, and Massa an engine failure. Kubica couldn't take advantage though, suffering all race with huge oversteer, only able to salvage 1 point, in 8th place. Hamilton managed to recover to 5th to retain his lead at the top of the Drivers' Championship, whilst one-time leader Kubica had slumped to 4th, 13 points adrift. The pace of the BMW Sauber picked up across the next 3 races, with 2 podiums for Kubica and 1 for Heidfeld. Kubica started 3rd in Valencia and was close to passing Hamilton at the start, but couldn't squeeze past and ran a steady race to 3rd. He was limited to 6th in the rain at Belgium after an issue at his second pit stop, but Heidfeld, running 9th with 2 laps to go, made the inspired call to switch to intermediate tyres as the rain started to fall. With the rest of the field tiptoeing around on dry tyres, Heidfeld carved his way up to 3rd, which became 2nd after Hamilton was penalised. Then, in more rainy conditions at Italy, Toro Rosso's Sebastian Vettel was in a shock pole position, whilst the championship contenders, Massa 6th, Kubica 11th, Raikkonen 14th and Hamilton 15th, were mired out of place and in the midfield. Both BMW Saubers timed their switch from wet to intermediate tyres perfectly in the race, with Kubica grabbing 3rd and Heidfeld 5th. With Massa and Hamilton only 6th and 7th and Raikkonen out of the points, Kubica closed back up to the lead of the title race, just 14 points behind. Singapore should have provided a race at the front between the title contenders after the 4 filled the top 4 positions and ran in the top 4 early on, but Nelson Piquet Jr.'s now infamous crash brought out a surprise safety car, and Kubica was one of the unlucky ones who had to pit for fuel when the pit lane was closed, earning himself the best present of a stop-go penalty. He dropped to the back and could only carve his way up to 11th. Hamilton was 3rd, and the Ferraris both failed to score, leaving the gap to title leader Hamilton now at 20 points. Kubica only started 6th in Japan, but a first-lap implosion of chaos from McLaren and Ferrari allowed him to sweep into the lead, followed by Alonso. Graining issues allowed Alonso to vault him in the first round of pit stops, and he dropped back into the clutches of Raikkonen. The two had a legendary duel over second for several laps, culminating in a side-by-side moment into turn 3, which forced Raikkonen out wide and kept Kubica in second to the flag. Despite running in a car which Kubica openly admitted had little to no improvements added to it over the last 3 months, he was still in championship contention, and heading to China was only 12 points adrift, with only 20 points available. It might have seemed like a lot, but observers were keen to point out that McLaren had a penchant for throwing away the championship in China, as they'd let slip a 17-point lead over Raikkonen at the same point last year. They wouldn't do the same again. Kubica struggled to find a balance in qualifying and would start down in 11th. An excellent recovery drive got him up to 6th, but a 1-2 for Hamilton and Massa had done the damage, and Kubica was officially out of the title race. Worse yet, the team misjudged the wet track conditions at the season finale in Brazil and started Kubica on dry tyres. He dropped down the order and was stuck in traffic all race, coming home 11th, with Heidfeld just ahead in 10th. Raikkonen, meanwhile, came home 3rd to snatch 3rd place in the championship from Kubica, whilst a 2nd place by Alonso demoted Heidfeld from 5th to 6th. It was salt in the wound for BMW Sauber, and the end of the year could not have stood up more of a contrast to their success at the beginning of it. BMW Sauber had improved once more on their previous year's points tally. They'd taken a pole position, won their first race with a 1-2 and scored 11 podiums throughout the year. But their drop-off in performance had left a sour taste in the mouths of so many. Kubica was seen up and down the paddock as the driver of the year, and many lamented the fact that BMW had been so rigid with their decision to focus on 2009. But that time had passed and there was no point continuing to ponder what if, for now all eyes were turned to 2009. With Kubica and Heidfeld both staying on for another year, despite rumours linking Fernando Alonso to the team, and the team's incessant rate of improvement across the past 3 seasons, all would be forgiven when BMW Sauber debuted their 2009 car and promptly swept to the title. After all, that was the plan, right? It'd look real silly if you sacrificed your first real shot at the F1 World Championship for the next year, only for that car to be absolutely rubbish. Initially, there were no concerns over the car's performance, and the BMW Saubers were close to tabletop as Toyota and Ferrari at pre-season testing. Then, champions-to-be Brawn showed up at Barcelona with their revolutionary double-deck diffuser, a loophole in the new technical regulations which allowed those running this new aero concept to have an enormous advantage in downforce compared to those without. It was what propelled Brawn to such a dominant success in the early part of the season, and their eventual championship glory. But rather than jumping on the bandwagon of this aerodynamic game-changer, like every other team was starting to, BMW had the mindset that the diffuser wasn't in the spirit of the regulations, and assumed it would be banned immediately, and thus did not put any effort into developing their own until a whole month after everyone else had done so. Technical director Willy Ramph later admitted, with hindsight, this was the wrong conclusion. In other news, the Pope is Catholic, and Luxembourg is small. Add to that there were issues with the front wing, problems getting their tyres up to temperature, and the new KERS unit causing issues with braking stability, and BMW might as well have been doing some lunges, given how far of a step back they had taken. So unsure were BMW on how to solve these issues, they split their KERS unit across the 2 cars, with Heidfeld running it for the first part of the season, and Kubica without. The early rounds appeared to paper over these cracks. In Australia, with just 0.2 seconds covering 3rd to 7th on the grid, Kubica had slotted into 4th. The team then played a tactical masterstroke by starting on the soft tyre, which, whilst faster than the hard tyre, was considerably less durable, compared to their rivals around them starting on the harder tyre. It meant that, whilst Kubica struggled during his opening stint, by the closing laps of the race, Jenson Button and Sebastian Vettel, 1st and 2nd, were struggling on the softer tyre, whilst Kubica, now on the hard tyre, was closing on the two at a vast rate of knots. With 3 laps to go, he made a move on Vettel, but there was contact between the two, and out went Kubica. Then, in Malaysia, Heidfeld made a great call for wet tyres that coincided with his first stop, and by resolutely sticking out on them, jumped up the order into 2nd, where he finished. Heidfeld later admitted that, whilst the result was good, he lamented not changing to intermediate tyres, as he felt he could have won the race. 2 races down, 2 very good chances at victory. But this was mixed in with an anonymous drive from Heidfeld to 10th in Australia, and Kubica retiring on lap 1 in Malaysia when his engine caught fire. The next few rounds would provide a much more realistic depiction of BMW's competitiveness. In China, Heidfeld started 11th, whilst Kubica was mired down in 18th. In an incident-filled race, both were outside the points by the race end. And then in Bahrain, where just 12 months earlier Kubica had taken pole position, the two were 13th and 14th on the grid, and after a clash between themselves and McLaren's Heikki Kovalainen, trundled home in 18th and 19th, last of the runners. Heidfeld scraped a couple of points in Spain after the team removed KERS from his car, but it all came crashing back down again in Monaco. A disastrous qualifying saw Heidfeld start 17th and Kubica 18th, only beating the equally struggling Toyotas. the race didn't bring any improvements. Heidfeld was 11th, whilst Kubica, apparently doing penance for a crime he wasn't sure of yet, suffered drive issues at the start, then a puncture, and eventually retired with brake problems. After 6 rounds, the one-time championship leaders the previous year were 8th in the constructors, ahead of only Toro Rosso and Force India, whilst Kubica, despite his showing in Australia, was pointless. A few people were beginning to suspect that the decision to ditch the 2008 car in favour of the 2009 car was not a smart move. In Turkey, Kubica came home 7th to record his first points of the season. By round 7 of last year's championship, he'd just won his first race and was top of the table. The mighty had so much fallen as plummeted. Britain, Germany and Hungary all provided sweet nothing in terms of points, and just a few days after the Hungarian Grand Prix, BMW announced to the world that they would be withdrawing from F1 at the end of the season. The company's board claimed it was in light of the bigger economic picture at the time, but if you looked hard enough, the dictionary definition of bigger economic picture came with the description poor on-track form. Perhaps that decision took the pressure off the team, as almost immediately their performances picked up. After Kubica stole the final point in Europe after a slow pit stop for Mark Webber, the team headed to Belgium for one of the lowest downforce tracks on the calendar. Its low downforce nature meant that it best suited those with excellent straight-line aero efficiency, such as BMW Sauber and Force India. Heidfeld qualified 3rd, whilst Kubica was just behind in 5th. Kubica passed Heidfeld at the start and ran in 3rd for most of the race, before being passed by Vettel at the second round of stops. He took 4th, and with Heidfeld 5th, the team had doubled their points tally for the year in one race. Another point followed in Singapore, before an impressively gritty drive from Kubica saw him take 2nd place at the Brazilian Grand Prix. The season rounded out with a 5th place from Heidfeld in Abu Dhabi, leaving the team with a total of 34 points and rising to an unlikely 6th place in the constructors. Since the announcement that BMW would be leaving at the year's end, the team had scored 28 points in 7 races, compared to 8 from the previous 10. Sold back to Peter Sauber, the team ran as Sauber from 2010 to 2018, but never again touched the heights of the BMW partnership, with the highlights being 4 podiums from Sergio Perez and Kamui Kobayashi in 2012. Since 2019, they've been rebranded as Alfa Romeo, and you'll spot them anonymously circulating towards the back of the midfield as of 2021. The ever-faithful Nick Heidfeld was left in the lurch after BMW's withdrawal. He was beaten to drives at Mercedes, Renault and Sauber, and ended up on the sidelines acting as Mercedes' reserve driver. When Sauber driver Pedro de la Rosa was dropped, Heidfeld returned to the team and scored 6 points, before 11 races for Renault in 2011 brought one last podium in Malaysia. Replaced mid-season by Bruno Senna, and his F1 career now at an end, Heidfeld still holds the record for most podiums, 13, and most second places, 8, without ever winning a race. Kubica meanwhile moved over to Renault for 2010 and was one of the drivers of the year, scoring 3 podiums en route to 8th in the championship. With the 2011 Renault topping pre-season testing times and a 2012 contract with Ferrari in his pocket, that missed 2008 title chance looked like it would rectify itself in the near future. But all that changed on the 6th of February, when Kubica was seriously injured whilst rallying in Italy, with his right arm partially severed in the accident. It ruled him out of the 2011 season, but the damage to his arm and the tight nature in F1 cockpit meant that his F1 career was over. He made a return to racing in September 2012, stepping back into rallying, and went on to win the 2013 World Rally Junior title, before spending the next 2 years competing at the top level in the World Rally Championship. Amazingly, he returned to an F1 cockpit in 2017, testing for Renault and Williams, and made a fantastic return to racing when he was announced as a race driver for Williams in 2019. It was an anonymous year, with Williams the slowest of all, and despite scoring a point at the German Grand Prix, the two parted company at year's end. Nowadays, Kubica is the reserve driver for Alfa Romeo, back with the Hinwil team with whom he tasted so much success. It would be easy to adorn the cape of Captain Hindsight and point at BMW's decision to stop development on their 2008 car in favour of 2009 as an enormous mistake, and to dub the entire enterprise as one big failure. But if we reflect on their 4-year spell as a works team, they weren't entirely unsuccessful. After all, of the 171 constructors to have entered an F1 race, BMW Sauber remain one of only 37 to have won a Grand Prix, as of the 2021 Hungarian Grand Prix, and their championship efforts came a lot closer and faster than the likes of other works entries at the time, like Honda or Toyota. There can be no denying that the decision to sacrifice 2008 for the sake of the next season, a season in which major technical changes were being introduced, was not an easy one. After all, you can be sure that the likes of Gene Haas and Gunther Steiner take no delight in watching their Haas cars circulate at the back of every race in 2021, even though they know all their efforts are being moved to 2022. But there's a difference between adopting that strategy when you're already towards the back and when you're staring down the barrel of a potential world championship. Sometimes you've just got to go for these things, and to hell with ramifications for the next year. Look at someone like former world champion Jody Scheckter, world champion in 1979, followed by scoring only 2 points in 1980. No one laments, what if Jody Scheckter could have won the title in 1980? That world championship will be attached to his name for the rest of history. As Kubica reflected at the end of the year, it's true that the team were not really planning to fight for the world championship this season, but in this sport you cannot plan everything. You have to just take this opportunity.